Welcome back to PJ Takes 5. Today is Tuesday, August 26th, and NFL teams are about to have their final 53-man rosters. But we start the day off by talking about week 0 of college football season. Pretty busy Saturday where we saw 6 different games get played. We're just going to talk about 3 big ones here, starting out in Dublin where Iowa State took on Kansas State in what was called Farm-O-Geddon. Pretty important game in the Big 12 there where you got 2 potential playoff teams battling it out for the 109th consecutive season. Pretty important rivalry. Like I said, we were in Dublin, Ireland, so we had some sloppy, rainy conditions to start the game, and that definitely impacted the play early on. You saw Kansas State muff the first punt of the game to set up Iowa State for a short field, and then Iowa State subsequently fumbled a pitch on the goal line. Between those two and a couple others, we ended up having 4 fumbles in the first 16 minutes, a little bit over the first quarter. So pretty sloppy to start out, but then the teams in the offense figured it out a little bit and got into rhythm. Big storyline in this game was the battle between 2 returning quarterbacks, Rocco Becht for Iowa State and Avery Johnson for Kansas State. Neither quarterback played particularly well, but ended with pretty good stat lines. Becht 14 for 28, 183 yards, 2 touchdowns, and then tacked on 18 rushing yards and a touchdown. And then Johnson 21 for 30 for 273 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks, and then another touchdown with 21 rushing yards. Quarterbacks, like I said, ended with pretty good stat lines, but neither really impressed, especially early on. I know they went a while without a completion on either side of the ball, just trying to run the ball with the rainy conditions. Then the big news after Iowa State won was the post-game fight that we saw leak out on social media between Johnson's father and his brother. Those 2 individuals were filmed fighting each other in front of a puddle outside the stadium after the loss. It was a big deal. They ended up issuing a joint apology. A weird situation where in one sense, they don't really have to apologize for anything. They're not associated with the program directly. And on the other end, it's just a bad look for the program in general, especially after a loss, and especially under the pretext of being in Dublin, Ireland, and probably drinking a decent amount. So definitely some of the fireworks after the game shadowed the performance on the field, but overall, just a really exciting way to wake up in the morning and see college football back on your screen. Like I said, with the fumbles and can't function early, it made you really think that college football was back. Fumbling the first punt return attempt of the college football season kind of felt pretty on brand for the sport in general, so it was a good way to see 2 relatively competitive teams battle it out and get the season started. Coming back to the United States, we had Kansas beating down on Fresno State 31-7. Another game that was headlined by the quarterback battle. E.J. Warner for Fresno State, Kurt Warner's son, didn't play particularly well. 18 for 29, 179 yards and 2 picks. Not a whole lot to work with in the offense around him necessarily, but definitely somewhat of a letdown performance, particularly with the turnovers. I'm sure Kurt Warner has told him the quarterback number 1 job is just take care of the ball and put people in good positions, and he didn't really live up to that standard, but Kansas is definitely the more talented team. I know their D-line was getting after him all day. Good that they got the touchdown early there, but after the first couple drives, it really got away from Fresno State, and Kansas went on to put up some big points throughout the game, and especially in the first half. Jalen Daniels, their quarterback, 18 for 20, 176 yards, 3 touchdowns, no picks, and then tacked on 47 yards on the ground. So he's a pretty interesting player, returning player for them, played pretty well last year in the Big 12. Potentially a Heisman candidate. You'd have to see if Kansas can get enough wins to be nationally relevant enough to have that conversation, but he's got a lot of really good things to work with, especially at the college ranks. 6 foot, 220-pound quarterback, so smaller guy, but not necessarily a thinner slider guy. Got some kind of that Baker Mayfield bulkiness and body type to him, so as we see in the Big 12, defenses aren't necessarily always the best, and Daniels is one of the only really dynamic quarterbacks to play in this Week 0 slate, but definitely showed off all the exciting aspects of his game that we saw from last season, and hopefully they can keep it up and he can carry those Jayhawks to better seasons than they've had in years past. They're in the middle of retooling that program a little bit, and he's going to be a big part of it this year, and he was last year, so good performance from him, good way to start the season off, obviously. And then the third and final game we're going to talk about here, Hawaii beating Stanford 23-20. Going to take a break from the quarterback for a second here. We'll talk about Stanford running back Micah Ford. Finished the day pretty productive. 113 yards and a touchdown on 26 rushes. Became the first running back of Stanford to punch a rushing touchdown in 20 games dating back to 2023, which is a pretty insane stat and one that shows the struggles they've had recently. Everyone wants to have the big time quarterback in college football or the NFL, but running the ball and running the ball effectively is such a big part of that. And the fact that they struggled so much over the past couple seasons really shows where they are as a program. And with Andrew Luck in there and Frank Reich as their interim head coach, they want to get that offense looking a little more pro style and doing things to take pressure off the quarterback position. So getting some production there was really helpful. But the big story is Hawaii quarterback Micah Olahado. 27 for 39, 210 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks. 36 rushing yards, his ankle early in the second half there, and had to step out for a second, but came back in and was hobbling up and down the field, but led his team to victory, including a 52-yard drive to set up a game-winning field goal opportunity for their kicker. And he did that just taking what the defense gives you, playing through the injury, trying not to roll out to the wrong side of the field, and was really impressive overall, just battling through it all physically, but mentally as well. And then the star of the game on the last play there, kicker Kansei Matsuzawa, 3 for 3 field goals, 2 for 2 extra points, but then hit that 38-yard field goal to win it for Hawaii at home. Really interesting story that was talked about a lot over the weekend, but kid from Japan saw American football being played and thought that was cool as a former soccer player, taught himself to kick the football off of YouTube videos, went to Ohio Hocking College, community college there to kick a little bit, and then ended up getting an offer to go to Hawaii. So pretty cool story for the kid from Japan to go all the way to Ohio and then a little bit back closer to home in Hawaii there, but to finish the first game that he's played there with a game-winning field goal was pretty cool. And then just a weird note that I thought a lot of times, especially early in seasons, you see Power 4 conference school host a smaller school. Kansas was hosting Fresno State there, kind of like that setup where both Division I schools, but the bigger school comes in the smaller school. And that was kind of the opposite for this game. So I thought it was a little interesting to see Stanford and the Power 4 conference go out to Hawaii. It was a little weird to see them start the season off like that, but overall, pretty exciting weekend. Not a lot of high leverage football games being played, but definitely the first taste of some real meaningful games, and it'll only continue to heat up. I know we got a couple big time top 25, top 10 matchups this Saturday and Sunday, so it's going to happen really fast here, and we're going to see more of the higher end teams pretty quickly here. So moving on down here, we got some NFL contract news. A couple of players that have really dominated the headlines this summer and into the training camp and into the regular season. So starting out with Terry McLaurin, Commanders receiver, signed a 3-year deal worth up to $96 million to end his hold-in. So it's important to state that it's up to $96 million. What the exact number year to year is going to look like is a little bit of a mystery, but $30 million signing bonus kind of modeled off that DK Metcalf contract from this offseason where he earned a 4-year deal that was worth $33 million annually. So just a little bit below that and a little bit shorter of a term than that. But according to Over the Cap, at max on this contract, McLaurin's going to be tied for the 6th highest average annual value amongst wide receivers alongside A.J. Brown with the Eagles. So pretty big payday for the receiver who turns 31 later this year. And the question that remains is, are the Commanders going to regret this a little bit? Probably a little bit of an overpay if we're going to be realistic. I mean, McLaurin's a great receiver. He's had 1,000 yards for at least the last 5 years with a bunch of different quarterbacks. So he's scheme independent, and just because the Commanders have really figured it out around him recently doesn't mean that his production is going to change anything. I think that's kind of a thing. But older receiver is one of those positions where you take some hits, you lose a step, and it's pretty easy to fall off the cliff a little bit. Not saying that he will, but definitely an overpay. Just that he's a player who means a lot to that franchise and those players and those fans, which makes a lot of sense. But you gotta wonder, by the final year or two of this contract, does it look like not such a great deal, especially when Deebo Samuel, who they traded for this season, is already kind of in that spot of making a lot of money comparatively to the player he is right now. Not saying that he's a bad player, but might be a step or two behind where he was in San Fran the last couple of years. So big news for McLaurin just to get that deal done. Big news for Jane Daniels, quarterback over there, to get his number 1 target back. But overall, felt like maybe if you would have gotten this deal done a little bit earlier, the number could have been a little lower. Maybe it's a hair too long, but we'll see how this contract looks at the end. But just excited for the Commanders to get back the number 1 receiver before week 1 here, so we can see the offense at full force. Very similar player in a very similar situation, Trey Hendrickson with the Bengals. Didn't get a new contract, but was able to get a pay bonus this season to the tune of a $14 million increase. So that's going to bump his salary up for the year to $30 million to end that hold-in. And there's also a $1 million incentive bonus if he can play 60% of the defensive snaps and if the team can make the playoffs. The team missed the playoffs last year, a large part because of that defensive play. Not Hendrickson specifically, he led the league in sacks, but in general, that unit really let them down. And hopefully Hendrickson can come back in there and stable that out a little bit so that that offense with Burrow and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins can get a little bit more of a cushion and a little bit bigger margin of error so that they don't have to be winning 54 to 53 ball games every single Sunday. But the weird thing with Hendrickson, so they didn't extend him, so next offseason he will still be an unrestricted free agent. So I know there's some talk if they were going to trade him or not. They were reportedly looking for high-end picks and a defensive player, and now they're in a position where they paid him this year. They'll have him for all games this year, barring injury. But this time next year, they could not have him and also not have any of the picks or a new player that they could have gotten from trading him. So not that he's currently untradeable. If you want to get to the deadline and send him away somewhere, that could make sense, I guess, but definitely feels like there's a realistic possibility where next offseason Trey Hendrickson just walks for nothing and the Bengals defense loses their best player on already pretty tough unit, and then there's a lot of question marks about what that defense is going to look like, and maybe if some of those offensive guys are really keen on sticking around somewhere where they really have no control of the other side of the field and nobody's really out there to help them. Good for him to see him get paid a little bit more. Still puts him definitely below some of the top end guys that we saw sign this offseason, like Myles Garrett at that $40 million a year number, but good for the Bengals to retain one of their biggest pass rushers and biggest pieces of that team in general and bring him in for the season, hopefully by week 1, like McLaurin, and then a couple guys who are still in the middle of their situations. Micah Parsons with the Cowboys is still looking for a new contract, set to play on the 5th-year option as a draft pick, which is about $24 million a year. Remains the only player holding in and not playing across the league. And it's just interesting because with McLaurin and Hendrickson, it always felt like something was going to get worked out, despite the trade rumors and requesting a trade and listening to trade offers. But this one definitely feels different, and it seems like it's not just about the money situation. We've heard news about how Jerry Jones goes about these negotiations and trying to corner players without their agents and get them to sign stuff, which has to be against some sort of NFLPA agreement. And if it's not, the association has to do a little bit better in figuring that out. But overall, he's laying on training tables and not wearing his jersey on the sideline of games and just feels really disconnected from that team right now. Probably to pull focus to the situation and pressure the team into getting something done, but overall, it does have a little bit of a different vibe than some of the other holdouts that we've seen in recent years, and the two that I already mentioned. So I know with like Khalil Mack to the Bears a couple years ago, we saw that trade happen right up against the start of the season, and we're approaching that timeline where if a deal was to get done and he was to get traded, it would have to happen sooner rather than later, more than likely, if a team wanted to have him for the entire season. But definitely feels like it's a little bit something else going on than just the money situation between the Cowboys and Parsons. And then our last player here, Cam Hayward, trying to get a pay increase. Set to make $14.5 million this season and next. 36 years old, counting for that last bite of the apple. A really productive player for them for several years, with the Steelers having so many older pieces in that team between Rodgers and Jalen Ramsey and TJ Watt and Hayward. It definitely feels like they're gearing up for somewhat of a last dance situation and one more run at the playoffs and at the Super Bowl if they can make it that far. So for that cause, getting one of the key pieces of that defense and one of the healers of that team overall in place and happy definitely feels like a priority. And I don't think, as of right now, Hayward's slated to miss any games because of this. He has said in the past that he's willing to, but overall, and that might be a situation where, similar to Hendrickson, it just makes sense to give him a little bit of a pay increase, make him feel happy, and then try to get into week 1 with all your guys on your team feeling really comfortable with where they're at, especially the leaders in that defense, like I said. Another situation to monitor, not as dire as the Parsons situation, probably won't be a trade anytime soon, but one that might impact some games here, especially earlier in the season. So moving on down here, some cuts and trades. NFL teams have to get their rosters to 53 people by 4 p.m. Eastern today on Tuesday. So we've already seen some trades leak out, and we'll continue to see some more. So just some notable ones that I saw. Lions released their offensive tackle Dan Skipper, was a backup tackle, swing tackle for them. 6'10", really big player, a player who came in through the worst days of that franchise and have been with them through the development and through like the NFC Championship caliber team that we've seen now. He got dropped, former undrafted guy, epitomized that team and that toughness for a little bit. And with the Ben Johnson connection, it's easy to think that he might be a potential Bear. The Bears have obviously had their offensive tackle problems throughout the offseason, and he's probably not a guy that you want to bring in as a starter, but definitely a guy who can bring up some backup versatility and can provide a different look on the goal line or short yardage on plays where you want to bring in 6 offensive linemen. So with Ahmed Aji potentially on the outs for the Bears, that could be an interesting avenue to add some experience and depth behind Braxton Jones and Darnell Wright outside of just the rookie Ozzie Trapillo. Lions also released quarterback Hendon Hooker. 27-year-old QB was the 68th overall pick in 2023. Put up really big numbers at Tennessee, but got injured and was going with the ACL injury coming out of college. But ultimately lost the QB2 battle to Kyle Allen this offseason, so they cut bait with him. Hasn't played a lot in the NFL, but still relatively younger at 27 years old. So he could definitely end up somewhere, either as a backup or a developmental piece. Similar situation, Buccaneers dropped quarterback Kyle Trask, 64th overall pick at the end of the second round in 2021. Lost that QB2 battle to Teddy Bridgewater. But again, another guy that could either be a developmental piece or just kind of a depth piece for some team out there. The Commandos dropped wide receiver Michael Gallup, another younger-ish player at 29 years old. Played 6 seasons with the Cowboys and then retired for a year and tried to make a comeback here with the Commanders. A player who can probably add some depth at receiver for some team. You know, the Raiders are kind of doing some receiver stuff with Jacoby Myers requesting a trade and signing Amari Cooper. He could be a guy that comes in and fights for some snaps in there. But yeah, 29, has had some injury problems, but definitely could have some good football in front of him. Saints released running back Cam Akers, a guy who's bounced around the NFL for a little bit, was with the Rams, then the Vikings, Texans, back to the Vikings. So the obvious thought would be that he could go back to the Vikings here. They have a couple good running backs with Jordan Mason and Aaron Jones Sr., but you can never really have too much depth out of that position. And it's also averaged 4.0 rushing yards in 5 years. So there's something to like there. Has never really been able to break through into that running back one role, but throughout the season, people get banged up, and it wouldn't be surprising to see him end up in a room somewhere. And then last one here, Dolphins cornerback Mike Hilton. Played 4 years with the Pittsburgh Steelers, played 4 years with the Bengals recently. Slot cornerback, I thought played pretty well with the Bengals, and when they were a playoff team, was one of the more important parts of that, the secondary, covering receivers at the slot and getting his hands on a lot of balls. So has never had a year where he didn't have an interception, but has only had a couple seasons where he had multiple. But overall, just a veteran player that a team could look for if they have problems in the secondary, especially in that slot position. Maybe try to move him back up to safety, which is a similar position, but you can play that without so much speed necessarily as you get older. And then a couple trades that really stuck out here. Raiders traded for Browns quarterback Kenny Pickett, was acquired this offseason via trade from the Eagles, and the Browns sent them to the Raiders for a 2026 fifth-round pick. And it's an important addition because Raiders backup quarterback Aiden O'Connell fractured his wrist, so he's going to miss 6 to 8 weeks, it sounds like. Definitely big to have a solid backup quarterback for the Raiders who's actually played before. I know they got a young rookie in there who they seem to like, but has no NFL experience, so to bring in a guy like Pickett definitely raises the floor up a little bit. And then that leaves Cleveland with Joe Flacco, named starter, and the 2 rookies, Dylan Gabriel and Shedeur Sanders. So I'm sure at some point we'll see one of, if not both, those rookie quarterbacks for the Browns, but getting Pickett out of there stops that logjam behind Flacco and creates opportunities for the 3rd and 5th round pick that they acquired in April. More quarterback trades. Vikings traded Sam Howell over to the Eagles. Eagles, similar situation. Backup quarterback Tanner McKee, who has a fractured thumb right now. He should be able to play at some point here, but just adding Howell to get a little more depth in that quarterback room as he goes through that injury process. 26 mid-round pick swap, so definitely not a lot of draft capital. But the Vikings did turn around and sign Carson Wentz right after that, so interesting to see the Eagles acquire a quarterback, and then that opened up room for the Vikings to sign a former Eagle in Wentz, who's bounced around a little bit since being a starter with them. And we'll see if he can bridge into that role as QB2 with the Vikings and see if he can develop under Kevin O'Connell and get us an opportunity to start, if not there, somewhere else in the near future. And then the last one here, Jets traded Derek Nandi to the Chiefs for 2027 late round pick swap, so really nothing of note capital-wise, but the Jets had already traded for a couple D tackles, Harrison Phillips from the Vikings and then Jawan Briggs from the Browns, so adding to that depth chart, and just needed to get somebody out to make some room. Sending back to the Chiefs, where he played for the past 7 seasons, was a big part of that interior line throughout their Super Bowl runs, and he'll look to have a similar impact on that defense alongside Chris Jones. So that's it for the NFL stuff here. Moving down to the Cubs. This weekend we saw the Cubs sweep the Angels 3-0, including a 12-1 win on Saturday night that featured 2 homers from Kyle Tucker. He also hit one in on the Friday game which was his first homer since July 19th. On Saturday, Reese McGuire hit a grand slam, first of his career, and then PCA homered on that Friday game, as well as Cal Tucker. So that was his first homer since July 23rd. So pretty long stretch for both those guys, and good to see them kind of get out of their funk a little bit and go yard after such a long time. But then one of the stars of Saturday's really blowout game there was Cade Horton. 3 hits and 7 strikeouts in 6 innings pitched. Really strong performance again from him. I think he should really be in the NL Rookie of the Year conversation. And there's a couple of fielders out there who are making a case, but the only other pitcher is Brewers pitcher Jacob Mizorowski, and the numbers between those two are really one-sided, going Horton's way. 1 WAR versus 0.5 for Horton, 17 starts for him as opposed to 9, and 2.88 ERA to 4.19. Even though Mizorowski is kind of higher up on the leaderboard, wherever you look, gambling or on MLB.com, Horton's numbers are actually significantly better. So hopefully as the Cubs get back up here and he continues to play really quality starts for them, he can get some of that buzz for NL Rookie of the Year. And like I said, so they're on the West Coast, played the Angels. They start a 3-game series in San Fran, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then a 3-game series at Colorado next weekend, Friday through Sunday, before going back to Chicago for a Monday, September 1st date against the Braves. So they're playing pretty good baseball. They're kind of hitting their stride again here. The Angels included. None of those teams are particularly dangerous teams in the MLB right now, but good to see them kind of stack some wins, and we'll talk about all the playoff races here in a second. But just overall, good to see the offense get back into the swing of it. Good to see the starting pitchers lock stuff down. The pitching staff seems to be stepping up to the challenge, and that was the big question mark throughout the regular season, and they'll get more opportunities to prove themselves here throughout the end of August and the start of September. But really just positive stuff in this really recent, 10-game stretch. I think they're 8-2 in their last 10, and they're putting it all together a little bit. So need to see Cal Tucker still play at a high level. Need to see PCA continue to play at a high level. They're getting a lot of production out of Michael Bush and Matt Shaw from the corner infields. Having depth pieces like Willie Castro and Owen Casey really helps. Everyone's stepping up and doing their part, which I know was a big conversation and a big frustration throughout July and the early part of August. So there's a lot of positive stuff with the Cubs right now. Going down to some of the MLB playoff races in general, starting with the NL Central with the Cubs, who are currently 5 games behind the Brewers. Over the past 10, like I said, Cubs are 8-2, but Milwaukee's 4-6 in that same stretch, including some of those games against the Cubs there. Cubs, the second easiest schedule remaining in the MLB, and Brewers have the 10th hardest, so definitely an opportunity for the Cubs to, keep biting at the heel there and try to track them down a little bit and win the Central if they can. But with the Brewers, the conversation remains that they peak too early throughout early parts of August and late July. It's more important how you're playing in September and the end of September, and the way they're positioned now, the Cubs definitely have an easier road and an easier way to find some momentum heading into the playoffs. So hopefully they can capitalize on this stretch and catch up to the team and retake the Central and be going into the playoffs here. Looking at the NL East, Mets currently 7 games behind the Phillies, who lead the division. They have a 1.5 game lead on the final wild card spot in the NL ahead of the Cincinnati Reds. But they do have the 3rd hardest remaining schedule. The Reds have the 2nd hardest remaining schedule, so that last spot in the wild card, assuming nothing changes too much here, should be an interesting race down the stretch. I know the Mets have a pretty big payroll, and the Reds not so much, but the Reds have been really well managed and have been quietly creeping into that spot, and it wouldn't be that surprising to see them overtake the Mets here. Heading out west, pretty interesting race between the Padres and the Dodgers. Entering Monday night, these two teams are tied. Dodgers lost the weekend series 2-1 to the Padres, but still have the season series, I believe 9-4, so they hold on to the tiebreaker if they were to end up with the same record, and they would win the NL West. But Padres do have the easiest remaining schedule, just a little bit easier than the Cubs do, and the Dodgers have the 5th easiest, so not the hardest thing ever, but both those teams obviously in a very close race and a lot of star power on both teams, and both are definitely candidates to potentially win the World Series if they get in or when they get in, and it'll be interesting to see who ultimately takes home field advantage, which isn't everything, but can definitely be a super important thing. Between those two cities and fan bases are so close to each other that I'm sure some of those games could feel like home games even if they're away, but definitely important to ultimately hold on to that home field position. And if something comes down to a Game 7 and you're playing at home, that might be the little bit of an edge you need to move on to the next round. Both teams up 6 games in the final wild card spot there. Whoever doesn't win the West is still definitely going to make the playoffs. But like I said, it should be a pretty hot race down the stretch here to see who can inch out in front of the other. Moving on down here to the AL. In the Central, the Tigers have essentially clinched up the division. I know it's too early for that, but they're second best record in baseball behind the Brewers right now, and no one else is particularly close. So they're in a pretty good spot here down the stretch. Royals 3 games back from the final wild card spot, potentially the best chance, certainly in the AL, but alongside the Reds and the NL there, to be a team who's currently looking out and to get into the playoffs. They've been picking it up over the past half of the season here, and don't need a big push to make the playoffs. Just 3 games, so definitely an achievable deficit to make it in. In the East, it looks like we could potentially have 3 teams in. The Red Sox are 4.5 games behind the Blue Jays, and the Yankees are 5.5 games behind. So Blue Jays pretty comfortable in that one spot, and then both those teams squarely in the wild card spot picture. Toronto, 6 hardest schedule remaining. Boston is about middle of the pack, and then the Yankees are the 4th easiest. So those could shake up a little bit, but as it stands, all 3 of those teams are probably going to make the playoffs, and it's nothing new for the Red Sox or the Yankees to be in the postseason, but the Blue Jays have really been turning it on recently. The Cubs saw them not too long ago, and they were pretty strong. And it'll be interesting to see if all 3 of those teams can hold in and get into the playoffs. And then out west, Mariners are just 2 games behind the Astros, and the Rangers are 6.5 games behind. Mariners currently holding on to that final wild card spot, and then the Rangers are 4.5 games behind for the wild card spots. If I had to guess, Mariners probably hold it in. And the Rangers are left looking out, but the Mariners, the big story has been Cal Raleigh, the catcher for them. He hit 2 homers on Sunday to up his season total to 49, which is currently the most by a primary catcher all time. So that number is only going to continue to grow, but he's had such a dominant season, and they were pretty aggressive at the trade deadline, thinking that they have a window and they're probably going to be able to make it into the playoffs. And with a lot of guys who can go yard, led by Raleigh, they're a team that could really make some noise out west in the AL. So like I said, a lot of interesting races that are going to come down the stretch here. A lot of tight division races, a lot of reshuffling of seeding. There's only a couple teams, the Rangers, the Reds, and the Royals, who are really dangers to jump into that playoff picture as of right now, but a lot can happen in a month, and some of these teams are going to go from second to first and first to second and take over a tied divisions, and it'll be a lot to keep up with, and should be setting up for a pretty exciting MLB playoff season. And then going on down here to our media review segment, I finished The Bear. There are 4 seasons now. I saw the first 2 closer to when they came out, and then took a break from the show, and then watched the 3rd and 4th this past weekend, but I'm happy to have finished that off. A Chicago-based show about fine dining and those guys working in the kitchen. So it stars Jeremy Allen White, who's a star-studded chef, traveled and trained all across the world, and comes back to Chicago to reunite with his family, who own a struggling Italian beef shop and was run by his brother who passed away. And it's a lot about him dealing with the personal side of life, but also kind of trying to take beef, fast casual spot and turn it into a potential Michelin star restaurant. So it's a really cool premise, and one that features Chicago pretty heavily, and very Chicago-like characters pretty heavily. My favorite part is early on in the show, when it's more about kind of changing the restaurant, overhauling it, and getting people into new positions to have bigger roles in a kind of dining situation, rather than just catching out the number 2 special or whatever. And they kind of lost some of that in the later seasons, where it becomes a little heavier, which is people kind of focus more on personal problems throughout their lives. But I thought the 4th season, the one that I watched most recently, obviously kind of went back into the parts of the show that make it really interesting, and just that it's about the restaurant and the workflow and how everyone coexists within the restaurant. So pretty good watch, pretty star-studded cast. They got Io Edibiri is a chef, Sydney, who works very closely with Carmen, Jeremy Allen White, and then Iban Mas-Baccarat is a cousin, Richie, who is pretty involved in the front of house stuff, and they get a lot of really good actors to come in and play smaller characters. Jamie Lee Curtis is the mom and isn't in every episode, but is pretty involved, and in this last season, Rob Reiner comes in and is pretty involved, and then just guys like Bob Odenkirk and John Mulaney and Sarah Paulson play kind of roles within the family. So pretty big cast, but from the day-to-day stuff, not all those guys are in it. Overall, I thought a really good show. I'm going to give it a 7.9 out of 10. If I had just stopped at season 3, it'd probably be a little lower, but the season 4 brought me back into it and reminded me of some of the better parts of the show. The personal growth of the characters, I think, is really cool, and and seeing characters go from kind of dire situations to finding goodness in their lives and the people around them, and their personal worth at the restaurant and within the family is pretty cool. So, like I said, overall 7.9 out of 10. Really liked it. Chicago-based, food-based show. It was really cool. And I think they're coming out with the season 5 next year at some point. Although the way the show ends, season 4 is a little bit obscure as to what the future plot end's gonna be. But Hulu original, so it's on there. I really liked it, and I'd encourage anybody to go watch it. So that's it for me today. Gonna do a preview show of the real week 1 college football stuff on Friday, and then we'll be into the full swing of football seasons, both the NFL and college, here pretty soon. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on Friday. Bye.